At the start, everything felt almost too good, but I didn't question it because relationship stories long usually begin with that warm glow that makes you drop your guard. He was attentive in a way that felt flattering, texting me first thing in the morning, remembering what I wore on our first date, saying things like he'd never met someone who understood him like I did. And I'll be honest, I ate it up. When you've been craving connection, those little gestures feel like proof that you finally found something real. I didn't realize yet that this was the opening scene of one of those toxic relationship stories that look perfect on the surface. Little by little, though, I started noticing how I adjusted myself around him without even thinking. I'd change how I said things so he wouldn't get quiet, or I'd skip small plans so he wouldn't tease me about my silly hobbies. It felt harmless, like the kind of compromise everyone makes. But every time I made myself smaller, something in me tightened, like a shoe that doesn't fit but you keep wearing because it's pretty. If I had been paying more attention, I would have recognized that early shrinking as a warning sign, the kind I later read about in books like Women Who Love Too Much. What confused me the most in those early days was how right everything looked from the outside. Friends would say, "Girl, he's so into you," and I'd smile like I agreed, while something deeper in me whispered that I was already bending too much. It felt like being in a room filled with candles, warm, pretty, comforting, while quietly smelling something burning, but pretending it's nothing. That tension between comfort and discomfort was the thread pulling me toward the next stage, even though I had no idea things were about to shift in ways I couldn't ignore. I started noticing the shift when simple conversations became emotional minefields. He'd twist harmless comments into accusations, saying things like, "You're being distant," or "Why are you acting weird?" whenever I didn't respond the way he expected. At first, I'd over-explain myself just to calm the situation down. That's how relationship stories long quietly reshape you. You begin defending yourself for things you didn't do. And every time I tried to stand my ground, he'd turn the guilt back on me so smoothly that I'd end up apologizing anyway. Soon, my daily choices stopped feeling like mine. I stopped wearing certain clothes because he'd joke that I looked like I was trying too hard. I avoided hanging out with friends because he'd say he just missed me whenever I left. Those comments sounded sweet on the surface, but they always came with a pressure that made me choose him by default. Toxic relationship stories are built exactly like that. Small, calculated nudges that make you believe you're acting out of love, when you're actually acting out of fear of disappointing someone. The strangest part was how invisible the damage felt. I didn't wake up one day thinking, "I'm losing myself." It was gradual. I laughed less. I second-guessed simple decisions like what to eat or what movie to watch. I felt tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. And the worst sign was this. I stopped sharing parts of my life, not because he forbid it, but because I knew he'd twist them into something negative. That's when I started realizing that something deeper was happening, something I couldn't keep ignoring much longer. The confusion really set in when his reactions stopped matching reality. If I brought up something that hurt me, he'd say, "That never happened," or "You're remembering it wrong," with so much confidence that I started doubting my own memory. That's when toxic relationship stories get dangerous, when you stop trusting yourself more than you trust someone else's version of events. I'd replay conversations in my head at night, trying to figure out whether I was being dramatic or genuinely hurt. The truth was, I couldn't tell anymore. He also had a way of turning every issue into something I caused. If he got angry, it was because I triggered him. If he pulled away, it was because I wasn't supportive enough. Meanwhile, I was bending myself into shapes that didn't even feel human. I'd Google things like how to communicate better in a relationship or signs I'm being too sensitive, instead of searching for symptoms of manipulation. That's how relationship stories long trap you. You keep fixing yourself for someone who isn't fixing anything. The emotional exhaustion became constant. I'd wake up preparing for the day like I was walking into an exam I never studied for. One wrong sentence could shift his whole mood, and I carried the blame every time. Yet somehow I still believed I could make it work if I just tried harder. Deep down though, something in me was starting to wake up, something that whispered that the problem wasn't my effort, but the environment I was drowning in. And that small voice, almost silent at first, would eventually grow louder. My turning point didn't come from a big fight. It came from a small moment that should have been ordinary. I remember sitting alone in the car after he dismissed something important to me again, and for the first time, the anger I felt wasn't toward him, it was toward myself. I suddenly realized how many times I had silenced my instincts just to keep the peace. That's when relationship stories long start breaking apart, when your intuition finally speaks louder than your fear. Little flashes of clarity began hitting me throughout the day. I'd noticed how tense my shoulders stayed around him, or how I'd rehearse my sentences before speaking so he wouldn't twist them. I began paying attention to these reactions like data points, almost like someone observing themselves from the outside. I even started journaling. Nothing fancy, just bullet points of what happened and how I felt. Seeing things written down made the truth impossible to ignore. I wasn't being loved, I was being managed. Once I allowed myself to admit that something was wrong, the fog around me started lifting. I began trusting small decisions again, choosing what I wanted to eat, saying no without apologizing, spending time with people who made me feel like myself. And each time I acted from intuition instead of fear, I felt a tiny spark returning. Toxic relationship stories lose their power the moment you stop believing the narrative they feed you. And I knew, deep down, that this spark inside me was about to lead me somewhere completely different. Once I admitted the truth, rebuilding myself became less about him and more about reclaiming basic pieces of who I used to be. The first thing I worked on was setting boundaries. Small ones at first, like not answering messages the second they arrived, or saying I needed time for myself without over-explaining. It felt strange, almost rebellious, but also grounding. In relationship stories long, reclaiming space is usually the first real step toward freedom, and every boundary I set reminded me that I still had a voice. I also had to unlearn emotional habits he'd trained into me. For months, I'd been conditioned to expect backlash for the smallest decisions, so choosing anything for myself felt risky. To break that pattern, I started making tiny choices daily. What music I wanted, what I wanted to wear, what I wanted to do after work. It sounds simple, but rebuilding self-trust requires repetition. I even read The Mountain Is You to help me understand why I kept shrinking myself. And it helped me see how toxic relationship stories turn self-abandonment into a survival skill. Slowly, I stopped chasing crumbs of affection. I realized that every time I waited for him to validate me, I was handing over a piece of my identity, so I began choosing myself instead. Eating alone at my favorite cafe, reconnecting with friends, and saying yes to things that made me feel alive again. And the more I returned to myself, the more obvious it became that staying in that relationship meant losing the last parts of me I had just recovered. That clarity led me to the moment I didn't know was coming, but I was finally strong enough to face it. The moment I decided to leave wasn't dramatic, it was quiet, steady, and final. I remember looking at him during one of his usual guilt-twisting speeches and realizing I felt nothing anymore. No fear, no confusion, no hope of change. Just an empty space where I used to twist myself into knots trying to please him. And in relationship stories long, that emotional silence is usually the sign that your soul has already left before your body does. Leaving wasn't easy. My hands were shaking when I packed my things, not because I doubted my choice, but because I knew he'd try to pull me back in with the same tactics. The sudden tenderness, the false apologies, the promises he recycled every time I got close to waking up. But I kept reminding myself that toxic relationship stories always have a pattern. The moment you break the cycle, the other person panics, not because they love you, but because they're losing control. So I walked out without giving him space to rewrite the narrative again. The first days alone were strange. The silence felt different. Not heavy, but spacious. I could breathe without waiting for a reaction. I could choose things without bracing for backlash. Even simple moments like making breakfast the way I liked felt like small acts of rebellion. And as each day passed, I felt the chaos inside me settling. That freedom, it was the confirmation I needed that leaving wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of something I had forgotten I could even have. What surprised me most after leaving was realizing that closure didn't come from him. It came from me. For so long, I thought I needed some final conversation, some apology that would make everything make sense. But when I started living again without shrinking, I understood the truth. The victory in relationship stories long doesn't come from being understood, but from finally understanding yourself. And reclaiming my voice wasn't a single moment. It was a series of small, steady choices that rebuilt the woman I had almost lost. I began speaking up again, even in places where my voice had been quiet for months. I said what I felt without rehearsing. I asked for what I deserved without guilt. And I trusted my own memory, my own intuition, my own emotional reality, things that toxic relationship stories slowly convince you to abandon. It felt like stepping back into my own body after living outside of myself for too long. That confidence wasn't loud or dramatic. It was calm, grounded, almost sacred. What truly sealed my healing wasn't walking away from him, it was walking back toward myself. I could see now how much I had survived, how much strength it took to leave, and how much courage it took to rebuild from the inside out. My voice wasn't just back, it was clearer, firmer, wiser. And I knew that this time I would never again let anyone edit my identity just to keep a relationship alive. It became obvious that the story was never about him. It was about who I became after choosing freedom. And if you've ever felt yourself shrinking inside a relationship, stick with me, because what comes after this kind of awakening isn't just healing, it's transformation. And I want to walk that journey with you step by step.